Hello, welcome to the Self-Learning Podcast by Dr. Sushma Singh. Let us start discussion on Unit 30, Tradition and Modernity. In this unit, we will take the topics of tradition and modernity. At the very outset, it is pointed out that the tradition and modernity are not contradictory or competing concepts. Rather, they represent different phases of meaning and are in fact symbiotically related to each other. As such, traditions or tradition is the ground from which all manner of modernity arise. Further, we may point out that as it stands, tradition has to be qualified, which it is to say it could be a local tradition or an all society tradition. Thus, there are many different strands to the thinking on tradition, and there are very many differing interpretations. Thus, tradition is a live and vital factor in many cultures and could be tradition of food and edibles, tradition of music and dance, scriptural tradition, artistic tradition, martial arts tradition, sociological tradition, and tradition and attire. Thus, the term tradition and modernity do not exist in isolation of each other, but are in fact related to each other. While these terms, concepts, and processes exist, they exist and function dialogically. Thus, modernity is an economic force, while tradition is fundamentally cultural and social. What is the role of tradition is a pertinent point here. Tradition is basically a series of attitudes, languages, music, art, scholarship, and so on, which have been developing since ages past. Over the passage of time, tradition becomes more or less entrenched in the body politic, and we have even traditional law and scriptures, which are in any case an aspect of tradition. Now, why is tradition so important to the individual and society? This is because it provides a continuity to social process and garners the creative and improvisational and transmits these traditions to the forthcoming generations of the members of a given society, and thereby assuring survival of the society itself. Tradition is therefore a repository of survival mechanisms without which a society would fail to cohere. It would set fragmented and break up, and the result of which would be anemic. Let us consider the music tradition in India. In this particular tradition of classical music, there are gharanas or groupings, and each of these has a lineage comprising the singers who had commenced or inaugurated the gharanas and all those who have passed their talent down the line, producing maestros who would take over charge once the older musicians went on into retirement. Now, once there is an example to work upon, we can see that tradition also implies a lifestyle, a way of living. As such, the training in music, art, drama is very rigid and within the confines of tradition. which often passes by vote and repetition of movement, notes, or other exercise which any particular training may require. Usually, with the teaching of traditional music and dance are an endless series of do and do's, which is what tradition is all about. Thus, tradition refers to a body of knowledge that has a structured inventory of actions and ideology that comprise its legitimate domain. Thereafter, it is a question of pinpointing what area of tradition is it that we are referring to. Thus, on examination, we find that tradition itself has a reasonably long duration for which it has established itself. Further, there are many different strands or what we may call varieties of tradition. Then to continue with the example of music gharanas in India, we find that there is a basic division between North Indian classical music and South Indian classical music. Each of these two basic divisions has numerous subdivisions and so on. It is therefore a misnomer to treat the concept of tradition as a term which covers everything in society and culture. Thus, if it is held that the tradition of music is very strong in India, it may also be asked what type of music tradition is it that is being referred to. Clearly, then tradition also represents a rubric under which all little traditions can be assimilated. If it is considered in depth, tradition can be seen to involve various different types of activities within it, which would need some brief elaboration. Tradition thus encompasses and embodies a particular process or legacy, sub-traditions which form the field from which required contributions can be made, a historical aspect, either oral or scripted, a certain concept of supernatural, economic structures of sustenance, aspects of indigenous art, facts of architecture, scholarship in all areas of social concern, literature, both scriptural and others, technological structures, and military for self-defense or offense. Thus, tradition is clearly a type of structure and ideology that has a past and charges over time to absorb developments in that field so that tradition remains itself, but at the same time recreates and expands itself. Now, let us wind up the session and take rest. Thank you very much for engaging yourself with a self-learning podcast.